Okay, so it's my great pleasure to invite for their presentation on evolving heritage values, Luke Donegan, Dr. Constance Wyndham and Peter White to present to you today. Luke has a Master's in Heritage Management from the Australian National University. He's worked in the heritage field for over the last 30 years and is currently managing the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage Sites of Truth-Telling program. And I can tell he's been in the industry for so long because I think he knows just about everyone here, by the looks of things. Dr. Constance Wyndham is a heritage and museums practitioner, a researcher and a sessional lecturer with experience in international museums and heritage work. She's worked for a range of museums and organisations across Australia, Afghanistan and the UK, including designing public programs and community engagement for the British Museum and Leighton House Museum in London. Her first book is recently out with Routledge, A New Politics of Heritage Reconstruction in Afghanistan in the Shadow of the Buddhas, 2024. Congratulations. She has a particular interest in access and inclusion in museums and currently works as a curator at Museums of History New South Wales on a project to recognise and record First Nations perspectives on the archaeology collection from the site of the first Government House. We have online, so you will see Peter's slides and you will hear Peter's voice, but you won't see Peter. So if you don't know Peter, you can just imagine what he might look like, or maybe Google him if you're that curious. Peter has over 30 years of experience in the creative and cultural heritage sector. He's a proud Gamilaroi Murray that leads First Nations cultural engagement at Museums of History New South Wales. Peter's work focuses on championing the cultural rights of First Peoples communities and guiding the mainstream cultural sector in respectful and effective engagement based on cultural authority principles. So please join me in welcoming our next speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's very hard following Steve, so my presentation is basically everything that Steve said. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present of this beautiful country we are meeting on today, Wajak Budja. I also acknowledge the challenges and hardships that Aboriginal people have faced because of colonisation, noting that the colonial experiment is not restricted to the past, but that the impacts are ongoing in WA today. And we can see this. If you look at any social, health, economic metric, you'll see that we live in an unequal society, community. So truth-telling, historical acceptance, truth listening, reconciliation is seen as the pathway towards social equity. So as I speak today, I'd like you to think about how can the heritage profession contribute to reconciliation in a meaningful way. I'm very privileged to present today with Constance and Peter from the Museum of History, New South Wales. I'll start with just some general comments about heritage practice and the importance of engaging with invested communities when making decisions about significant places. And then Constance and Peter will present a case study of a project that they're working on in partnership with the Gujaga Foundation regarding the first Government House National Heritage Property. So traditional heritage practice developed through the 1970s to the mid-1990s viewed heritage values as static in nature, to be documented and encapsulated within a statement of significance and then preserved for future generations through conservation activity. And while this approach endures, there is a growing understanding, as Steve said, that heritage properties and their associated values are in reality dynamic. They change, evolve, degrade, renew due to time and surrounding activity and pressures. And similarly, the way communities value places also changes and evolves. Statements of significance or outstanding universal value may no longer accurately describe a property's significance due to changed or lost attributes revealed significance, developing knowledge, or evolving community values. For example, in the early 1990s, when Fremantle Prison closed and then reopened for tours, community regard for the place was relatively low, and many people would have happily have seen that place demolished. Today, it's a World Heritage Site with high local community regard. There is a growing appreciation of concepts like intangible heritage, social or associative heritage value, cultural landscapes, and the importance of communities to understanding heritage significance. Relatively recently, community became a major strategic objective of the World Heritage Committee, one of the 5 Cs. This evolution of perspective is evident in an increasing awareness of the concepts that Steve talked about in his presentation. Heritage practitioners are questioning conventional practices and embracing new approaches to heritage. That said, the system we work in is hardwired to be objective. We define and endeavour to preserve properties in time and place for future generations. Embracing subjectivity and change in this context can seem radical and potentially risky. So let's consider why we protect heritage value. Heritage, according to the 1972 World Heritage Convention, represents the shared history and values of humanity. It reflects our cultural and natural diversity, linking past, present and future to foster social cohesion and a sense of belonging across generations. Through interpretation and community engagement with significant places, heritage provides a sense of shared identity. So fundamentally, heritage is about building social capital, which is the glue that holds societies together. The World Heritage Convention, with the World Heritage List as its main deliverable, was the beacon of post-World War II international attempts to build global social capital, with the ultimate goal being world peace. So what's the consequence if we lose heritage and its associated social capital? When humanity loses pieces of its shared story, future generations are deprived of their rightful inheritance, including their identity and their historical continuity. Economies can decline with reduced tourism, loss of jobs, weakened local economies. Community pride, resilience and intergenerational transfer of knowledge is undermined. And all of this can contribute to social instability, increasing the risk of violence and conflict. So the point of heritage portfolios, including world, national, state and local lists, is to build social capital. By developing a heritage list, we construct a representation of what our community values. But how do we decide what goes on that list? How do we choose between similar places? Is there a power dynamic at play in this process? And how are the values of marginalised people in our community represented? Western Australia's 3 World Heritage Sites that are listed for their natural attributes include Purnululu, Shark Bay and Ningaloo Coast. These exceptional landscapes, sculpted over millennia, have ongoing ecological and biological processes unique in the world. They are also cultural landscapes managed and protected by traditional owner communities over tens of thousands of years. They represent the oldest, deepest and most intact cultural and spiritual connections between people and place in the world. But these cultural values are not included in their statements of OUV. They definitely deserve their place on the World Heritage List, but by not including these cultural values, undermines their significance and disenfranchises their traditional owner communities. Was this the outcome of a result of unconscious cultural bias or a simple act of not understanding their cultural significance? So until recent years, heritage assessment in Australia lacked meaningful consultation with Aboriginal communities. Visitors may recognise the exceptional beauty of these places, but they miss the cultural landscapes and the deep connection to country. When I visited Purnululu a few years ago, I saw an incredible landscape of geological features. formed by depositional processes and weathering over 20 million years. Absolutely amazing. What I did not see at that time was a landscape formed by the Narankani, a concept encompassing ancestral beings, creation events, laws and ceremonies. To the Jaru and Gija people, this landscape is not static but dynamic, a place of great spiritual and cultural significance where the Narankani is still active. I learned this through subsequent conversations with the traditional owners. Recently, last week or the week before, Jane Lydon from UWA, who's here somewhere, Isla Nicol from DPLH, who I hope is here too, and myself visited historic sites in Kalgoorlie related to the Aboriginal experience of colonisation in the goldfields. We saw 3 hostels, including the Kalgoorlie Hostel for working girls, Nindambai for high school children, and the Millen Street Hostel for working age boys. These hostels operated between the 1970s and the 1990s. Kalgoorlie Hostel, which you can see, was established in 1976 for young Aboriginal women from outback communities and local camps. It also accommodated young women in family crisis and those who had been referred through the youth justice system. In 1979, the hostel accommodated 14 girls who came from the Mount Margaret Mission, which was the first slide I had up, and from Esperance, Laverton, Leonora, Norseman areas. Today, these hostel buildings are unoccupied, run down and boarded up. They're not the architectural masterpieces that you would associate with a heritage list, and they're not listed on the State Heritage Register. But they are associated with significant history. They are a way station on an intergenerational journey of people of country to ration stations, to missions, reserves, hostels. People who have experienced family separation, violence, incarceration, generational trauma and poverty resulting from colonisation and past government policy. So these places embody a rich, recent, tragic, challenging history for Aboriginal people. And this is a history that few non-Aboriginal people are aware of. Without activation and maintenance, these places will eventually disappear, and with them their associated values, the history and experiences of young Aboriginal people. For some, this may be a convenience, erasing an uncomfortable part of our history. But for others, the willing erasure of a people's history and culture is a human rights violation. And these places are just the tip of the iceberg. On our Sites of Truth-Telling database, we've documented close to 300 places related to this overarching history of impacts of colonisation in WA. Today, we are standing on the precipice of lost history. The connections between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people that create social capital are few and fragile. And our social cohesion and sense of belonging across generations is under major stress. And we've seen that in the last couple of years with The Voice and so on. If we lose these pieces of our shared history, future generations will be deprived of their rightful inheritance and historical continuity will be lost. So how do we go about understanding whether these hostels and places like them are worth protecting? A critical part of heritage practice that we often get wrong is understanding who the invested community of a potential heritage place is. The invested community is the people whose stories and experiences are fused to the fabric of the place. They are the rights holders, the people through which the heritage significance of a place lives and breathes. For Purnululu, the invested community was the Jaru and Gija people. For Fremantle Prison, it's the ex-prisoners, the ex-officers and the victims of crime and their families. For the Kalgoorlie hostels, the invested community is the children who live there. And for places associated with the history of past and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism in WA, the history of frontier violence, forced migration, segregation, assimilation, child separation, incarceration and survival, it's the Aboriginal people. What about people who aren't part of the invested community, but people who want to understand these places and engage with their stories, like everyone here? These people are the reachable community. This group also has a part to play in this social contract. So how do we bridge that knowledge gap between invested and reachable communities? If we as heritage practitioners want to understand a place, we need to talk with that place's invested community. If we want the reachable community to understand and appreciate that place, we need to find ways to preserve its heritage attributes and facilitate community engagement with those attributes through interpretation. So understanding and appreciating the place loops back and supports the invested community's values and experiences. Heritage practitioners play a crucial role in connecting these groups and facilitating the sharing or transfer of heritage value. The act of being a heritage practitioner is one of bridging social capital. So, and there is a lot of significant work in the heritage sector today to bridge invested communities with reachable communities and to better represent marginalised people on heritage registers. For example, the Heritage Council of WA and the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage are reviewing the State Register of Heritage Places and prioritising the registration of places associated with marginalised peoples. The Sites of Truth-Telling program, with its focus on historic places of significance to Aboriginal communities, is contributing to this work. Fremantle Prison and the Australian convict sites are building relationships with Aboriginal communities impacted by these sites and their associated colonial history. And the Australian World Heritage Advisory Committee is working with the Commonwealth Department, DQ, and World Heritage properties such as Purnululu, Shark Bay and Ningaloo to support the recognition of their Indigenous communities' cultural values in those properties' statements of OUV. And Constance will talk about their example. I've got one last slide. I'll be very quick. Two, sorry. Talking to people leads to greater understanding. The problem, however, with this kind of heritage work is that sometimes it leads to the revelation that what we've done in the past is no longer accurate or right. Statements of significance are foundational texts that detail why a place is important. They identify heritage values that demonstrate why the place is worthy of preservation for future generations. But the function of the SOS or the SOUV is to frame or support permanence, in effect binding the significance of a heritage place to a moment in space and time, to which all future conservation activity should return that place to. The operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention states this. So statements of significance do not square with the idea that heritage value is something that is dynamic, that changes with time. In practice, it is very difficult to update statements that no longer accurately represent the heritage values of a place. The SOS can, in effect, block the revision process and deter the need to engage with the invested community because it gives us the idea that the heritage has been defined already. But the endeavour is important. If, for example, the invested community is a marginalised community that experiences ongoing prejudice, then inaccurate or underrepresentation of their significant cultural heritage becomes a social justice issue. The resulting damage to their identity, social cohesion and social and emotional well-being is a human rights issue, and we have that today in WA. Reconciliation is the label given to the process of bridging the divide between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians. This process is essential to achieving cultural safety and equity for First Nations people. How can we, as heritage practitioners, contribute to closing this gap? Our role as part of the reachable community is to listen, to embrace new understandings, and to facilitate change. In this diagram, if we relabel interpretation with truth-telling and understanding and appreciation with truth-listening which is something that Constance will talk about, then we can see that this process of looping back and bridging social capital in the Aboriginal historic heritage context, it creates a space for reconciliation. So if we want to make a meaningful contribution to this process, we must continue talking with the communities invested in the places we are surveying, researching, nominating, registering, conserving, interpreting and activating. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Luke. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you for your interest in our project, Luke, and for inviting us here to present today. Thank you also to the department for supporting that, and to Alethea, who also supported us. Before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the land on which we meet today and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are also joining us. My name's Constance. I'm a curator at Museums of History in New South Wales, and I'm going to talk briefly about a project that Peter White, who is our head of First Nations Cultural Engagement, and I are working on in collaboration with the Gujaga Foundation. So the Gujaga Foundation is a group focused on cultural research and language revitalisation, Dharawal language revitalisation at La Perouse, which is a place close to Sydney, out at Botany Bay. They're part of the Aboriginal community out at La Perouse. And Museums of History, I should say, is an umbrella organisation which has a number of historic houses and sites and collections. We're focused on the presentation and preservation of history in New South Wales. So before I discuss the project in any detail, I need to talk a little bit about the history of this site to put it in context. I won't go into a detailed history here, but there are a few key moments that we need to understand in order to understand this project. So the site of First Government House is on Gadigal land, where this place was occupied by different clan groups that lived in and around coastal Sydney for 60,000 years before the first fleet arrived. In 1788, that little house that you can see there, that modest three-room house, was built soon after Governor Phillip and his first fleet arrived, and the idea was to build a building of colonial administration where they were going to administrate the colony. And that house was lived in by successive governors, not lived in, it was worked in by successive governors, and it was extended a number of times before it was demolished in 1845. It sits just above Circular Quay on the corner of Bridge and Phillip Streets. That middle picture there is what happened in the 80s and 90s when there was a threat from developers to build a 37-storey tower on that site. Archaeological excavations were undertaken and 140,000 objects were unearthed from the remains of its house, its footings, its bricks. There's evidence of Aboriginal visitors to the site, clay pipes, drinking vessels, animal bones, a whole lot of artefacts. And that third image there is in 1995, the Museum of Sydney opened on that site. So there was a campaign which was won by the historians and the campaigners to build a museum over the site of First Government House. So only about half of the story as we know it has been popularly told of this place. I think we can call this pretty much ground zero for colonial intrusions. And this was a place of imprisonment for First Nations people, of resistance and conflict, as well as diplomacy, despite unequal power relationships. This place represents very much these twin processes of colonization and dispossession. It was a place where policies and laws were made about First Nations people, and it was also a place of lack of treaty, of course, as we know. Given this history, what can a place like this afford? I think we can use that term. Can it be a place of reflection, truth-telling, and most importantly, truth-listening? So the background to this project is that the site was listed in 2005 on the National Heritage List. And this listing, as you can imagine, is very much focused on the material fabric of that site. It was based on that archaeological collection. And there has been no examination thus far through a First Nations lens. And so in 2023, the Commonwealth Government released a series of heritage grants, and Museums of History applied for one, First Nations heritage grants, to help identify and protect First Nations heritage in existing world and national heritage listed places. And the impetus was the destruction at Juukan Gorge. And so we applied for a grant for this one-year collaborative project between us and the Gujaga Foundation, started last November. And the objective is to progress the National Heritage Listing, so to update that statement of significance and that listing, and also to inform strategic directions for the site, and also think about interpretation and displays of objects at the Museum of Sydney. So just to give an idea of some of the collection, so there are 140,000 artifacts. We're definitely not looking at all of them. There are 20,000 bricks. So on the left are what we've been calling the kind of direct Aboriginal artifacts as they have become known, and these objects show direct evidence of having been worked by First Nations people that were in and around that site, so using kind of stone tool technologies to work with these newly imported materials of glass that were brought by the colonists, and also flint. Flint came on these big lumps of ballast that were used to weigh down the ships in the First Fleet. And so we can also talk about how these objects can tell stories of cultural continuity, adaptation, and creativity. Other objects on the other side of the screen, we're engaging with some of the bricks. The mortar that was used to stick the bricks together sometimes contained shell middens. Parts of shell middens were used in that mortar. So that has significance for our project partners who are members of Sydney's coastal communities, talking about that. The gin bottle obviously represents the introduction of alcohol to the colony. The significance of new species is something that we've been talking about. You can see cow and sheep bones there on the slide, and what this meant for Aboriginal people, because as well as country that was being destroyed for pastures, cows were also unwitting colonists and expanded that early colony of Sydney southwards by straying into the area that we now know as cow pastures. Fish bones, and what we can say there about access to resources, lack of access to resources, and cultural rights around fishing, for example. And then that object bottom right are musket balls, so this very kind of heavy, powerful, difficult object to talk about because it's very much representative of acts of colonial violence. So in order to surface these insights and perspectives and stories, we have co-designed a methodology of knowledge sharing workshops to identify, document, and record previously overlooked values, perspectives, interpretation, and stories associated with this collection. So we're doing these workshops at Museums of Sydney. We're also taking objects out to La Perouse. We're trying to be as kind of trauma-informed as we can by discussing what objects we might be looking at beforehand. And so everybody is pre-warned about what we might be looking at. We are designing the workshops iteratively, and they are inquiry-led. So we design one, and we see what interests come up, where we might like to take the second one, rather than designing them all from the outset. They are non-extractive. We're not recording any information at this stage. They are dialogic. So we have a range of interests and perspectives and experiences on our team. We have a botanist, we have an archaeologist, we have a historian, we have a weaver. Everybody comes with very different perspectives. And so we're trying to start with the idea that no one really knows, start from this idea of uncertainty and adopt this position of epistemic humility. And I think here it's very much about the process rather than the kind of shiny outcomes of interpretation and displays and exhibitions. It's about the process of these workshops and the relationship building that goes on through them, and creating access and enabling a sense of ownership over this collection. So the project outcomes to date, hang on, has that gone? Yeah. We're only 5 months in, but we've been thinking about, well, we have already informed strategies for management and care of some of these objects which have cultural sensitivities. So integrating First Nations ways of seeing into our museum storage collections, storage management strategies, collections management strategies. How to store, where to store, do we put cultural warnings on them, for example. We're getting beyond seeing this site in isolation, thinking about what broader stories we can tell about Aboriginal presence and activity in this part of Sydney at that time by linking this collection with relevant sites and collections. We're trying to strip away some of those ways of seeing that are so dominant in museums, focused on materiality and age, and think a lot more about use value and how objects were made and how they were used. And thinking about what are the assemblages, what are the different connections here between objects. And we've talked a bit about the relationship, for example, between the sheep bones and the musket balls, and the stories you can tell there about First Nations people that were perhaps persecuted for stealing stock. And we've also talked a lot about access to places to fish, access to shellfish, to food, and how there has been such a loss of that, and what this collection symbolises in terms of that loss and disruption of access. But as well as these stories of cultural disruption and loss, of course, there are those other stories of adaptation and creativity that you can tell through those glass and flint objects. So I'm just onto the last slide now, but I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of this project. So I work in a museum, and there is a need for interpretation and content and public-facing outcomes. But this project, the real value of it, I think, is in the process. And so there is that tension there, but we have had a lot of support in focusing on this process, and an understanding of the workshops as an output in themselves, and as a way to build connections, and as a way for knowledge to be transmitted as well through those workshops. Of course, we all know that grant structure and timeframes are an issue when such a project needs time. There's also a lack of a current mechanism by which to update a heritage listing. And there's also the need to integrate our insights and perspectives into the current framework for the listing. So those kind of two sets of knowledges will need to somehow be joined together, and that's something that we're thinking through. I think what is real co-design is a really important question, and what does that mean? What is best practice? And if we're thinking about co-design, what are the markers of success for each project partner, and how are they different? And how do you do co-evaluation as well? And of course, the kind of burning issue is museums are colonial spaces with collections. There's an unequal power dynamic. There can be a lack of trust. How can we mitigate that? I think the answer is that we can't, and that you need to be explicit about that, and whenever possible, adopt a kind of trauma-informed cultural safety approach, discussing the history of objects, taking objects out of these places into community, allowing for flexible timeframes, and allow projects to be very much led by community. So it's been a great privilege to work with Peter White on this project, who I've learned a lot from. Peter's now going to discuss some of his perspectives on this work, its challenges, and the recognition recognition of First Nations heritage values in the heritage museum sector more widely.